Hello and welcome to our series of Lent reflections from the Beecham community at Newland in Malvern. I'm Father Andrew, the acting chaplain. And this Lent I thought it would be worthwhile focusing a little bit on the idea of the journey into the wilderness, a feature of course of Jesus' own modelling of our Lenten experience. And I'll start, if I may, by reading part of the Gospel that was set for Ash Wednesday this year, which describes Jesus' experience of going into the wilderness. This is from Mark chapter 1. And the Spirit immediately drove Jesus out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and the angels waited on him. Admirably short, as it always is with Mark, but there's so much in that short passage that we can reflect on in these coming weeks. And I thought today it might be good to start with the idea, which is well expressed in the version I read, the New Revised Standard Version, where the Spirit is described as actually driving Jesus out into the wilderness. And that's a good translation of the Greek, because the word that's used is actually the same word that's used later in the Gospel when Jesus is driving out demons from those who are ill. So it's a very forceful word. Doesn't necessarily mean compulsion, I think, in the sense that Jesus was unwilling, but he was impelled by the Spirit to experience this time in the wilderness. And it's something that we're encouraged to do, not forced, not impelled in quite the same way, but a journey that we too can make over these coming weeks. I guess when we think of wilderness, we think of deserts, particularly the hot deserts of the earth, and also indeed the icy deserts of the world. But I want today actually to think in a slightly broader sense of the deserts, as it were, of space around us. And I'm old enough to remember, though I was quite young then, the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969. And I remember that as an amazing moment in history. I can't quite remember the moment of watching them first walk on the moon, though I'm sure I did. I do remember being called back in from playing in the garden to witness the safe return to Earth of the astronauts. But I remember that as well as this astonishing experience of seeing humans walking on the moon, I was very touched by the role played by Michael Collins in the command module, the third man, the one who didn't land on the moon, and who had that really rather austere experience of being alone in the command module while his colleagues were on the moon. And I believe that as he went around the moon onto the dark side, for something like 48 minutes at a time, he was totally out of contact with the Earth and with them on the moon. So he was, in that sense, the most remote human being in history. He was further away from fellow humanity than any of us have ever been or have been since. Interestingly, in his own autobiography, he describes it as a very positive experience. He said that time alone gave him a sense of awareness, of anticipation, even satisfaction and confidence, and almost a sense of exhilaration. It was a positive thing to be part of something so great, even though his own role was somewhat isolated. And those amazing achievements were brought to mind again this week by the wonderful news of the landing of Perseverance, the module that's landed on the planet Mars. You've doubtless followed some of that on the news, and it's been an incredibly inspiring story. And I think that current Mars mission says a lot about human ingenuity. I found it actually quite emotional watching the BBC website and seeing what skill has gone into this. It's an amazing journey. It has involved all sorts of dangers along the way, but we're having these wonderful experiences now as the first photos come back and we understand the process of the scientific examination and discovery going on. So it's there primarily to search for signs of ancient life and to consider whether these might indicate the possibility of some sort of human survival on Mars, as well as actually giving us a bit more information about our own history, our own geological and biological history. I think I read that the plutonium batteries will allow the rover, in theory, to go on for 10 years. I think the initial plan is for a year's work on the surface in the immediate area. And as it sends back photos, it's also preparing to take samples, soil samples and so on. And it's collecting those, and I understand it's actually going to drop them. It's going to sort of wrap them, as it were, and drop them, ready for collection by a later module, a module that will actually be sent out on a subsequent mission, a sort of fetch rover, which will in due course return the samples to Earth, and I think we can expect them back by around about 2031. Quite astonishing, really, to think that we'll have not only samples from the Moon, but also from Mars back here on Earth. Of course, there are huge technological challenges. So, for example, I think signals from Earth to Mars can typically take about 11 or 12 minutes. So you can't direct the rover in the same way that you might do with a radio-controlled toy car. And so that's involved some ingenious pre-planning. Well, I'm not just here to talk about space, but I thought there were some interesting parallels and ideas we can draw from this amazing journey and compare it with our journey in a sense. Though I should say straight away, the biggest danger is probably of using analogy. One's got to be very careful not to make too many broad comparisons. But I'd like to pick up on a few reflections based on what is going on in that journey and how it may impact or make us think a little bit about our own Lenten journeys. So to go back to that first point I made, being driven out, the Perseverance was landed there by direction. It didn't just appear on the surface of Mars like further sort of space matter. There was a deliberate, planned progress and intention behind it. And it's our understanding that we too are not simply on planet Earth by chance, that we are here because God has planned in his wisdom and in his love for there to be human habitation on this earth, human relationships, and indeed a human stewardship of this very precious space in the universe. And that understanding that God plans our existence inevitably involves the idea that God both sends us out, drives us out as it were, but also calls us and directs us in our lives. It's something which comes across in ancient philosophy, the understanding that our lives, in a sense, have a purpose. There is a sort of blueprint of human nature. We are not just random. We are put together, as it were, with a particular plan in mind. And that's been debated and disputed by philosophers, but it is a very strong strand of thought, that there is, in a sense, a blueprint as to what it is to be human, just as you might have a blueprint for that rover. For us to work at our best, in a sense, is to live according to the way God has made us and guided us. Of course, that's open to interpretation and understanding, and through prayer and our time, as it were, in the wilderness, we can perhaps begin to glean a deeper understanding of what it is that we're made for and that purpose for which we've been brought onto this earth. Secondly, and this is where the analogy could get very dangerous, I suppose, it's interesting, isn't it, that the Mars rover had to be pre-programmed. It had to be set up in advance, and a lot of the technology programmed into it, although it's open to subsequent adjustment. And I say the danger of the analogy is I don't think that we are pre-programmed. Our lives are not deterministic. God gives us free will. And one of our understandings of our human state is the way in which we use that freedom, hopefully to respond positively to God and to live in the way he calls us, though, as we know, sin is so often the mark of our deciding to do it our own way, to think we know better. But that idea of purpose and direction and calling comes across strongly again, the sense of a right way to live. We can contrast perhaps the way that in the 20th century existentialist thinkers put across the idea that really we are just thrown into the world. We're like someone pushed onto the stage and we have to make a play up for ourselves. The Christian understanding is actually that there is something more than that. There is a way to be, there is a path to follow. And yet there's a lot of flexibility in that. So we have both the idea of a purpose for our lives and the freedom to discern and live that out. So often it's the time spent in the wilderness that gives us space to confront that and ask those deep questions. What am I here for? What is my life about? How do I respond to God with this precious gift of life that he's given me? And a third aspect, perhaps, is the idea that distance is no object, as they say. This 7-month journey to Mars, which I understand, I had to look up these figures, I'm no scientist, but Mars varies in its distance from Earth between about 55 million and 400 million kilometres, and we're somewhere in the middle at the moment, about 200 million kilometres apart. So there's a huge physical distance between those, as it were, controlling the project on Earth and the rover on Mars. And yet across that distance you can sense almost, I think it's not overstating it to say, a love for that machine and what it's doing, a great concern. There's an investment, I don't just mean a monetary investment, there's an investment of time and energy and care, emotional commitment to what this mission is about. So despite the huge distance, there is a real sense of contact, a sense of concern and living alongside each other, as it were, man and machine. And that, I think, is a very good analogy for our relationship with God. There is, of course, the distance, not perhaps physical distance in the way we understand it, but the distance between God and us. And yet that distance is as nothing when we're able to listen to God's voice and hear his prompting, and to know that that love, like their love, is something, of their concern, is something which transcends all distances of time and space. And finally, perhaps linked with that, is the sense that isolation doesn't mean that we're the only thing in the world, what is called solipsism by the philosophers. By being separate, by spending time in the wilderness, we're not necessarily turning our back on what it is to be human. Perseverance can be likened to us and our hopes. It's designed to do a job, to help us to understand the universe more. And so it has a part in the wider whole. It is so far away from us, and yet its work will impact on our lives. And even in isolation, indeed perhaps precisely because we do spend the time in Lent to reflect, to step aside, we're part of God's people still. We're understanding what it means to live for one another. So perhaps in future reflections I'll talk a bit more about what the desert experience is in terms of how we might approach it. But I thought it seemed too good an opportunity to miss to reflect on this very exciting piece of progress in science and in our understanding of the universe, and to realise that we too are making a journey. And like perseverance, our journey into Lent is going into territory which is only partly known, it's only dimly understood. And the more we're able to take time aside, to be alone, even perhaps to be lonely at times, the more we're able to tune into this sense that God has placed us here with a purpose, and perhaps to tune into what it is that our understanding of his loving purposes for us may be. Like perseverance, we're always invited to stay in touch with God. So going into the wilderness for Jesus certainly wasn't escape. It was confronting the reality of his mission, and it is for us. But that space for reflection is space for growth as well. Space for understanding more deeply ourselves, and more importantly others, and more importantly still, God. So I wish you a continuing blessed time in Lent. Time hopefully to reflect, to be alone in the wilderness, but not totally alone, and not in a sense totally in the wilderness either.